On the 3rd of July, 1778, roughly 375 men marched out of a timber fort in the river country of northeastern Pennsylvania to the sound of a fife and a single drum. The tune was St. Patrick's Day in the Morning. They carried a flag. Most of them were not soldiers at all. They were farmers, old men past their prime, boys too young to shave, a thin handful of regulars home on leave. And they marched out into the afternoon heat to defend the valley where their families lived. By the time the sun went down, more than 300 of them were dead. The men who killed them lost 2 rangers and a single warrior. 8 more were wounded. 227 scalps would be carried north in the days that followed, counted out in an officer's own report like coins. 5 men were taken alive. Everyone else who fell where they stood or where they were caught, in the corn, in the brush, in the brown water of the Susquehanna as they tried to swim away. Think about that ratio. More than 300 dead on one side, 3 on the other. That is not the arithmetic of a battle. That is the arithmetic of a slaughter. And the men who designed it knew exactly what they were doing. The numbers themselves come to us from imperfect places, partly from the victors who had reasons to boast, and partly from the survivors who had reasons to grieve. And the two do not always agree on the smaller details. Historians still argue over whether 400 marched out or 375, whether 300 died or somewhat fewer. But on the shape of the thing, every source agrees completely. An entire community's fighting strength walked into the woods and did not come back. This is the story of how that happened. But it is also the story of something stranger, something that the famous tales of the Wyoming Massacre almost never tell you. Because the men who won this battle so flawlessly, so cheaply, so completely, within 2 years, they would come to count it among the worst things that ever happened to them. The trap they sprang in the wilderness would close slowly and patiently on their own people. And the British Empire, which had just proven it could win anything the frontier had to offer, would learn to dread that frontier with a fear that bordered on superstition. Because the wilderness did not take sides. The wilderness kept a ledger, and in the end, it collected from everyone. Battles on the frontier were not fought the way the rest of the revolution was fought. There were no neat lines of redcoats on open fields, no drummers marking time while gentlemen exchanged volleys at 50 paces. Out here, in the dense forests and black swamps of the Susquehanna Basin, European military doctrine was worse than useless. It was a death sentence. The trees swallowed formations. The terrain dictated the rules. And the men who understood that terrain, who could read a tree line, vanish into a marsh, wait in total silence for hours, held an advantage that no amount of training in the European style could overcome. The forest was not the stage on which this war was performed. The forest was a character in it, and it was the most dangerous character of all. By the end of this video, you'll understand 3 things that the old massacre stories leave out entirely. First, why the men of the Wyoming Valley were doomed not by the enemy at their gates, but by a quarrel among themselves. A bitter, bloody feud that had been burning for 100 years before the first shot of this battle was ever fired. These people had spent decades making enemies. In 1778, the bill for those enemies came due all at once. Second, how a single misheard word, 2 syllables, swallowed by smoke and panic and the screaming of men, turned a disciplined maneuver into the destruction of an entire valley. The line did not break because it was weak. It broke because of a mistake so small you could miss it. One order, given correctly, heard wrongly. And third, why a perfect victory in the wilderness ended with the victors' own families freezing to death in the snow outside a British fort, digging caves into frozen ground, eating bark and the maggot-ridden scraps of hides to stay alive. This is the part nobody dramatizes, because it doesn't fit the story of savagery and revenge that Americans told themselves for 2 centuries. But it is the truest part of all. Here are the questions that should keep you watching. How did fewer than 1,000 men erase a valley defended by hundreds and walk away having lost almost no one at all? Why did experienced officers, men who knew precisely what was waiting in those woods, march their farmers out of a fort they could have held for days? What really happened at the rock by the river that American newspapers would inflate into a national nightmare? A story so powerful, it helped pull a French fleet across the Atlantic? And why, in the end, did the most one-sided victory of the entire frontier war become the thing that broke the people who won it? This is the story of a trap inside a trap. Of a place where you could win everything and lose far more than you ever imagined you had. The frontier gave the British their cleanest victory of the war. Then it presented its invoice. Before we step into the smoke, take a second to subscribe. These long histories live or die on it, and it genuinely helps them reach the people who'd want to find them. Now, let us go back to the Susquehanna, to a valley that had already been at war with itself for a very long time before the British ever arrived. To understand why a few hundred men made the catastrophic decision they made on the 3rd of July, you have to understand that the Wyoming Valley in 1778 was not a peaceful Patriot homestead suddenly visited by horror. It was a powder keg with a long fuse already lit. It was a place where neighbor had been killing neighbor for the better part of 2 decades, over a question that, on its surface, sounds almost absurd. The question was, who owned it? The valley itself is a fertile ribbon of bottomland, about 25 miles long, running along the Susquehanna River near what is now Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. Rich soil, good water, worth fighting for. And it had the terrible misfortune of being claimed, simultaneously and with total conviction, by 2 different colonies. The roots of the disaster reach back to the 17th century and to the careless hand of an English king. In 1662, King Charles II granted Connecticut a royal charter, and that charter, drawn up by men with only the haziest notion of American geography, extended Connecticut's western border all the way to the Pacific Ocean. A thin horizontal slice of a continent, granted on paper to a small New England colony. 19 years later, in 1681, the same crown granted William Penn an enormous tract for the founding of Pennsylvania. And the 2 grants overlapped, directly, right across the Wyoming Valley. So here was the situation. 2 colonies, 2 royal charters, 1 valley, and a crown 3,000 miles away that had effectively promised the same ground to 2 different sets of people without ever realizing it. This was the cartographic time bomb at the heart of everything that followed. The men who would die at Wyoming and the Loyalists who would help kill them were in many cases the descendants of people who had been fighting over these lines on a map since before the Revolution was even imagined. In 1753, with the smell of land speculation in the air, a group of Connecticut investors formed what they called the Susquehanna Company, with the explicit aim of settling the Wyoming Valley and making the Connecticut claim a physical reality. The following year, in 1754, they bought the land, or believed they bought it, from a delegation of Iroquois at a conference in Albany. It was a transaction that the Pennsylvania authorities denounced as fraudulent, that many of the indigenous nations themselves disputed, and that would poison relations in the valley for a generation. Pennsylvania, which had already established its own trading presence in the region, regarded these incoming Connecticut Yankees as nothing more than armed squatters, trespassers, thieves with a worthless deed. And so the fighting began. Not the revolution. This was years before that. This was a private war between colonists, a series of brutal little campaigns that history remembers, almost gently, as the Yankee-Pennamite Wars. The valley changed hands again and again. Forts were built and burned and rebuilt. The Connecticut settlers raised defensive structures with names that would echo through the massacre to come. Fort Durkee and Forty Fort, the very stockade from which the doomed militia would one day march. Pennsylvania answered with armed columns sent to drive the Yankees out by force. There were sieges. There was arson. There was martial law imposed in the deep woods by men with no authority but the gun. It went in waves. In the first round, around 1769 and 1770, the Connecticut men founded Wilkes Barre and dug in, while Pennsylvania militia tried repeatedly to expel them, and Fort Durkee passed back and forth between the two sides, like a contested trophy. For a moment, in 1771, it looked settled. The Crown leaned toward Connecticut's claim. The Yankees built a township they named Westmoreland and behaved as though the matter were closed. It was not. In 1775, in the very year the Revolution began, a Pennsylvania colonel named William Plunkett led 700 men up the valley to finish the Yankees once and for all, and was ambushed and beaten at a place called Rampart Rocks, a defeat that locked Connecticut's grip on the valley, just as the larger war for the continent erupted around them. Sit with the irony of that for a moment. The men of the Wyoming Valley entered the American Revolution as battle-hardened victors of a war against other Americans. They had learned, in the hardest possible school, that the way to hold their land was to march out and meet their enemies head-on. They had won that way before. That lesson, march out, attack, do not cower behind walls, was burned into their collective memory. And in 1778, it would lead them straight into a swamp full of waiting guns. This is the thing the massacre legend always erases. These were not innocent lambs. They were the survivors of a vicious land feud, and the feud had shaped them. It had shaped their pride. It had shaped their contempt for caution. And, crucially, it had created a population of bitter, dispossessed enemies. Pennsylvania men driven from their farms by the Yankees during the land wars, who were now scattered across the frontier, nursing their grievances, waiting. When the British came looking for guides and Loyalist fighters who knew the Wyoming Valley intimately and hated the people in it, they would find no shortage of volunteers. The valley had been manufacturing its own executioners for 20 years. But to truly understand the catastrophe, you have to meet the men who held the Yankee claim by force. And in particular, you have to meet one man whose pride would do more damage on the 3rd of July than the entire British Army. By 1770, the Susquehanna Company had a problem. Holding contested land in the wilderness required not just settlers, but enforcers, hard men willing to do hard things. And so the company reached out to a group already infamous across the Pennsylvania frontier, the Paxton Boys, recruited out of Lancaster and Dauphin counties. You need to understand who the Paxton Boys were, because their reputation is essential to everything that follows. In 1763, a mob of these frontiersmen had committed one of the ugliest atrocities of the colonial era. They had descended on a small community of peaceful, Christianized Susquehannock people, the Conestoga, and murdered them. When the survivors were placed in protective custody in a workhouse in the town of Lancaster, the Paxton Boys broke in and slaughtered the rest. 14 men, women, and children, killed in a building meant to keep them safe. It was butchery, and it was unpunished. And it announced to the entire frontier exactly what kind of men these were. These were the enforcers the Susquehanna Company hired. They were offered generous land grants in the Wyoming Valley, in Hanover Township, in exchange for defending the Yankee settlements. And they were led by a man named Lazarus Stewart. Hold that name, Captain Lazarus Stewart. Remember it, because in a story full of British cunning and Iroquois skill, it is this man, one of the defenders, one of the supposed victims, whose recklessness would help seal the valley's fate. Stewart embodied a specific and poisonous kind of frontier character. He had a deep, performative contempt for caution. He despised civil authority. He carried the casual, lethal racism of a man who had built his reputation on violence against Native people. And he possessed, above all, an aggressive machismo that could not tolerate the appearance of fear. To a man like Lazarus Stewart, the careful, patient choice was always the coward's choice. And patience, in July of 1778, was the only thing that could have saved the valley. The Paxton boys injected this temperament into the very leadership of the Wyoming defense. Entitlement, swagger, and a bone-deep belief that the bold man always wins. It was a belief forged in the land wars, where boldness had, in fact, worked. But the Seneca were not the Pennsylvania militia. The men waiting in the swamp were not bluffing. And the lesson of the Yankee-Pennamite wars, that the way to win was to march out and fight, was about to be tested against an enemy who had built an entire trap around the certainty that someone, eventually, would do exactly that. Here is the bitter truth at the center of the Wyoming story. The truth the propaganda was invented to bury. The trap was set by the British, but the door was opened from the inside. And the hand on that door belonged to one of their own. While the valley quarreled with itself, the larger war had been transforming the Wyoming Valley into something far more valuable than a contested patch of bottomland. It had become, almost by accident, one of the most important food sources of the entire American cause. By the time the Revolution erupted, the Yankees had finally achieved a fragile dominance over the valley. And under their control, the rich soil had done what rich soil does. The Wyoming Valley bloomed. It became a granary, a breadbasket, producing grain and livestock and surplus on a scale that mattered enormously to a young army that was, very often, starving. And the Continental Army was starving. Picture the winter of 1777 and 1778 at Valley Forge. Men without shoes, men without coats, men dying of disease and hunger within a day's ride of comfortable Philadelphia. George Washington's army did not lose its battles in those years so much as it nearly dissolved from sheer privation. Food was not a luxury in that war. Food was the war. An army that cannot eat, cannot fight, cannot march, cannot exist. And the Wyoming Valley, far up the Susquehanna, was quietly shipping out the grain and the cattle that helped keep the Patriot cause breathing. The British, operating out of Canada, were not fools. Their strategists looked at the map and understood the valley's significance with perfect clarity. Destroy the Wyoming Valley, and you do not merely burn some farms. You sever an artery. You strike at the logistical spine of the rebellion itself. You make Washington's hungry army hungrier. And here is what made the target so irresistible. The valley was almost defenseless. This is the cruelty of how it had unfolded. The most capable, battle-tested fighting men of the Wyoming Valley, the very men who had won the land wars, who knew how to fight in this country, had largely marched off to join the Continental Army. They were away, fighting Washington's war on distant fields. What remained behind to guard the valley itself was the scrapings of the manpower barrel. The old, the young, the untried. A militia of farmers and grandfathers and teenage boys, stiffened by only the smallest detachment of regular soldiers. A rich, vital target, guarded by men who had never seen a real battle. To a British commander planning a frontier campaign, the Wyoming Valley in 1778 looked less like a fortress and more like an open granary, with the door swinging in the wind. What turned this opportunity into a campaign was a disaster that had befallen the British the previous autumn. A disaster that forced them to rethink the entire shape of the war. In October of 1777, a British army under General John Burgoyne had surrendered at Saratoga. It was a catastrophe for the Crown, and it changed everything. Saratoga convinced France that the Americans might actually win, and France, hungry for revenge against Britain, formally entered the war on the American side. The conflict was no longer a colonial police action. It was now a world war, and Britain suddenly had to husband its strength. The lesson British command drew from Saratoga was that conventional campaigns deep into the populated eastern heartland had become dangerously expensive. So the strategy shifted. If you could not easily smash the rebellion in its center, you would bleed it from its edges. You would turn to the frontier and wage a campaign of attrition, burning settlements, destroying crops, terrorizing the civilian population, and forcing Washington to peel away precious Continental troops to defend 1,000 miles of vulnerable backcountry. You would make the frontier so terrifying, so costly to hold, that the rebellion would bleed out slowly from its extremities. The Wyoming Valley was to be a centerpiece of this new strategy, rich enough to matter, weak enough to take, and isolated enough that when the blow fell, no one would be able to stop it in time. The wilderness strategy had a terrible logic to it, but it carried within it, from the very beginning, the seed of its own undoing. Because a strategy built on terror produces martyrs, and a strategy built on burning the food of a continent eventually leaves your own allies with nothing to eat. The British were about to learn that the frontier, once you chose to fight on its terms, did not let you set the terms of your departure. The man chosen to bring this strategy to the Wyoming Valley was a seasoned, methodical officer named Major John Butler. And it is one of the small, sharp ironies of this story that the valley would be destroyed by a butler and defended by a butler, two men who shared a surname and absolutely nothing else. They were not related. Keep them separate in your mind, because the confusion between them is old and easy. Major John Butler operated out of Fort Niagara, the great British stronghold on the western frontier, and he served in the British Indian Department, the branch of the war machine responsible for managing the Crown's alliances with the indigenous nations. Butler understood the frontier the way few European officers ever did. He knew that you did not conquer this country with parade ground tactics. You conquered it with men who belonged to it. And so he was authorized to raise a corps of Loyalist irregulars, frontiersmen, woodsmen, men who could fight the wilderness way. They became known, after him, as Butler's Rangers, and they would become one of the most effective and most feared fighting units of the entire war. Butler's invasion force is most often put at around 700 men, though here, as with nearly every figure in this battle, the exact count is genuinely disputed, the sources giving ranges rather than certainties, with some estimates running as high as 1,000 or more. The historian's honest answer is that we are working with educated approximations. But the well-attested core of the Army broke down into two distinct elements, and understanding both is essential. The first element was the Loyalists. Butler's Rangers themselves, about 110 of them, in the figure most accounts settle on, joined by a detachment of Sir John Johnson's Royal Greens and other Loyalist volunteers drawn from Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey. And here is the detail that gives this campaign its venom. Many of these Loyalist men were not strangers to the Wyoming Valley at all. They were former Penamites, the very men who had been driven from these farms by the Yankees during the land wars. They were coming home. They knew every path, every ford, every fence line. They knew the names and faces of the men they were marching to kill. And they came fueled by something more potent than royal loyalty. They came for revenge, and for the farms that had been taken from them. For these men, this was not a distant strategic operation ordered by command in Niagara. This was personal. This was 20 years of grievance, sharpened to a point. The second element, and the larger one by far, was Indigenous. The overwhelming bulk of Butler's force, the 464 warriors most accounts record, with some estimates higher, was drawn from the nations of the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, predominantly the Seneca and the Cayuga. And these were not auxiliaries tagging along behind the British. They were the heart of the army, and they were led by their own commanders, men of enormous reputation and skill. Chief among them was Enraged, called by the British the Old King of the Senecas, a war leader of formidable ability, and, as the day would prove, a tactician the equal of any European officer on the continent. Beside him fought Corn Planter, another Seneca leader whose name would echo through the decades to come. These were experienced, disciplined, deadly men who had every reason to fight. The American advance threatened their homeland. The land frauds of the previous generation, including that disputed purchase at Albany, had taught them exactly what the settlers' victory would mean for their people. They were not fighting for British pay alone. They were fighting for the survival of their nations against a tide of settlement that, if it crested, would sweep them away entirely. History would prove that fear to be precisely, devastatingly correct. Now, here is where we have to correct one of the most durable myths of the entire affair. And correcting it matters, because the myth was a weapon. For more than a century, popular accounts insisted that the great Mohawk leader Joseph Brant, Thayendanegea, the most famous Indigenous figure of the Revolution, was the mastermind of the Wyoming attack, the monster who orchestrated the massacre. It is one of the most repeated facts about the battle. And it is false. The military records are clear. Brant was not at Wyoming. He was nowhere near it. At a strategic conference at Tioga Point in early June, the leaders had divided their efforts. Butler and Enraged would strike the Wyoming Valley. Brant would turn north to raid entirely separate settlements in New York, places like Cobleskill and Springfield. The two operations were distinct. Brant's hands, whatever else they did in that war, were clean of Wyoming. So why does the lie persist? Because Joseph Brant was famous, and a famous villain makes a better story than an accurate one. American propagandists needed a face for their nightmare, and Brant's was the most recognizable Indigenous face in the war. They pinned the massacre on him because it was useful, not because it was true. We will return to this, to the deliberate, calculated manufacturing of the Wyoming legend, because it turns out to be the most strategically important thing about the entire battle. For now, simply hold on to the principle, because it runs through this whole story like a vein of iron. In the Wilderness War, the story of what happened mattered more than what happened. And the story was very often a lie. Butler's coalition came down the Susquehanna in canoes and rafts, Loyalist and Iroquois together, some 700 strong, riding the current toward a valley that was about to discover just how alone it truly was. Against this descending storm, the Wyoming Valley could muster a defense that was, on paper, almost pitiful, and in reality, even worse. Nominal command fell to Colonel Zebulon Butler. The other Butler, the Patriot one. And he was, to be fair, the best that the Valley had. He was a Continental Army officer, home on furlough, a veteran of the French and Indian War with real battlefield experience behind him. He had been a principal architect of the Yankee victories in the land wars. If anyone in that valley understood what was coming and how to survive it, it was Zebulon Butler. He knew, in his bones, that raw militia could not stand against veteran rangers and Seneca warriors in the open. He knew that walls were the valley's only real advantage. His tragedy is that he understood all of this perfectly and was overruled anyway. Supporting him was Colonel Nathan Dennison, the local militia commander, a steadier and more cautious man, and Lieutenant Colonel George Dorrance. Together, these three formed the experienced core of the defense, the men who counseled patience. Around them gathered the company captains, each leading a fragment of the valley's manhood. The numbers tell their own grim story. The entire American force amounted to somewhere between 375 and 400 men. Of those, only about 40 were Continental regulars, actual trained soldiers under Captain Dethick Hewitt. The rest were militia, organized into companies that read like a census of the valley's surviving menfolk. There was the Shawnee Company under Captain Asaph Whittlesey, around 40 men. The Hanover Company under Captain Lazarus Stewart, our Paxton boy, perhaps 30. The Lower Wilkes-Barre Company under Captain James Bidlack, Jr., some 38. The Upper Wilkes-Barre Company under Captain Resin Gear, about 30. The Kingston Company under Captain Aholiab Buck, roughly 40. And then perhaps 100 more. Unaffiliated, irregular, men who simply showed up with whatever weapon they owned because the valley was their home and the enemy was at the door. Look closely at that roster and you see the truth of it. These were neighbors. These were companies named for the little settlements they came from, led by local men, filled with brothers and fathers and sons from the same handful of farms. When this force was destroyed, it would not be a regiment that died. It would be a community. Nearly every family in the valley had a name on that list. The cruelest fact of all hangs over the whole order of battle. The men who could have saved them were not there. Captain Simon Spaulding's company of seasoned Continentals, the reinforcement that Zebulon Butler had begged Congress to send, the help that might have changed everything, was on its way. But it was still 50 miles distant when the British arrived. 50 miles in 18th century terms was days. Days the valley did not have. The relief column was real. It was coming, and it would arrive to find only smoke and bodies and the survivors weeping. Help that comes too late is, on the battlefield, the same as no help at all. And the valley's defenders knew it was coming. That knowledge, that if they could just wait, just hold the walls for a few more days, salvation was marching toward them, should have been the strongest possible argument for patience. Instead, in the fury of the council, it would be brushed aside. The valley was, in every sense that mattered, alone. It is tempting to imagine the people of the Wyoming Valley as oblivious. Peaceful settlers struck out of a clear sky. They were not. They knew. The horror of what happened is sharpened by the fact that they had been warned, repeatedly, and watched the disaster assemble itself over weeks. All through the spring of 1778, rumors had run up and down the frontier like fire through dry grass. A great host was gathering in the north, at Oswego, at Niagara. Loyalists and Iroquois massing for some terrible purpose. Spies brought word. Friendly Indigenous informants brought word. Again and again, the settlers of the frontier were told plainly to evacuate, to gather, to prepare for the worst. The warnings were not subtle, and they were not rare. The valley simply could not bring itself to abandon the harvest, the homes, the farms that were the whole reason for its existence. Zebulon Butler had done what a responsible commander does. He had ridden hard for York, Pennsylvania, where the Continental Congress had fled after the British took Philadelphia, and pleaded in person for troops. Congress had responded after a fashion by merging the remaining Westmoreland companies into a single unit under Captain Simon Spaulding and ordering them to the frontier. But orders move faster than men, and men move slower than fear. While Spaulding's column trudged toward the valley, Butler's canoes were already on the river. The bureaucratic machinery of the young republic simply could not move fast enough to outrun 700 men coming downstream with the current at their backs. And then the warnings stopped being rumors and became blood. On the 30th of June, Butler's advance parties announced their arrival in the only language the frontier truly understood. A group of settlers was working in an unprotected cornfield near a tannery by the river, going about the ordinary business of survival, tending the crops the valley needed so badly. An Iroquois and Loyalist raiding party fell on them. The brief, savage encounter that followed became known as the Wyoming Massacre, named for some of those who died, and it killed several settlers in a matter of minutes. Small in the brutal accounting of the campaign, decisive in its effect. Because the Wyoming Massacre did exactly what it was meant to do. It shattered the valley's nerve. Word of the killings raced through the settlements, and a panicked exodus began. Hundreds of women, children, and old people abandoning their isolated farms and streaming toward the safety of the valley's stockades, gathering above all at the largest of them, 40 Fort. The valley's population was being herded by terror into a handful of crowded wooden boxes. That herding was not an accident of war. It was the opening move of a strategy. Butler was not trying to fight the valley. He was trying to break it before the fighting even began. And the upper end of the valley broke without a struggle. On the 1st of July, Butler's forces arrived at Fort Wintermute, sometimes recorded as Wintermute's Fort. And something remarkable happened. The garrison surrendered. Not a shot was fired. The Wintermute family, it turned out, harbored strong Loyalist sympathies, and there were credible suspicions that they had been acting as spies for the British all along. The fort opened its gates. Butler walked in, and he made it his headquarters. Just like that, the trap had a forward base, handed over without a fight. The next day, a combined detachment marched on the nearby Fort Jenkins. Outnumbered, surrounded, and badly frightened, those defenders capitulated too. And here, Major John Butler revealed the truly intelligent thing about his campaign. The move that separates a competent commander from a brilliant one. He was generous. To the men who surrendered, Butler offered terms that were almost startlingly lenient. Lay down your arms. Agree to remain neutral for the rest of the war. Do this, and your lives are spared, and your property is protected. No reprisals. No burning. No killing. Go home and stay out of it, and you and your families will be safe. Understand what Butler was doing, because it was not chivalry, whatever it looked like. It was psychological warfare of the most sophisticated kind. By demonstrating, visibly, repeatedly, that peaceful surrender brought genuine safety, Butler was systematically dismantling the will to resist. He was teaching the valley a lesson. Fighting means death, but surrender means life. He wanted to take the entire valley the way he had taken Wintermute and Jenkins, without a battle, by making the alternative obvious. Every fort that gave up peacefully made the next surrender easier. He was rolling up the valley not with volleys, but with reassurance. And then he sent a flag of truce down to the largest prize of all, the crowded heart of the valley's resistance. He sent it to 40 Fort, demanding its surrender on the very same terms. Disarm. Stay neutral. Live. Inside 40 Fort, that offer landed like a stone into a pond already trembling. Because behind those walls, crammed in among hundreds of terrified refugees, the leadership of the Wyoming Valley was about to tear itself apart over the most important decision any of them would ever make. On the morning of the 3rd of July, 1778, the officers of the Wyoming Valley gathered inside 40 Fort to decide whether to live or die. They did not know they were deciding that, of course. They thought they were debating tactics. But there has rarely been a clearer fork between survival and annihilation than the one those men faced that morning. And there has rarely been a worse choice made. The crowded fort was a pressure cooker. Hundreds of women and children and old people packed the interior, their fear a physical presence, their eyes on the officers, their lives in the balance. And in that atmosphere of barely controlled panic, the War Council convened. On one side stood the experienced men. Colonel Zebulon Butler, the Continental veteran, argued for the only sane course. Hold the fort. Stay behind the heavy timber walls. He was supported by Colonel Nathan Dennison and Lieutenant Colonel George Dorrance, the steadier heads. Their reasoning was unanswerable. Their militia, farmers, boys, old men, was hopelessly overmatched by the Rangers and the Seneca in any open fight. The fort was strong. Its walls could absorb what flesh could not. And this was the decisive point. Spaulding's Continentals and additional militia under Captain John Franklin were coming. Days away. Maybe only days. Every hour spent safely behind the walls brought rescue closer. Hold the fort, wait for the relief column, and the valley might survive. March out, and they were trading their one advantage, those walls, for a fight on ground the enemy had chosen. To the professional soldiers, it was not even a difficult question. You wait. You always wait, when help is on the way and the walls are high. But against them rose the younger officers, the aggressive faction, and at their head stood Lazarus Stewart. Stewart could not abide the thought of waiting. To him, sitting behind walls while the enemy ranged free was intolerable. And not only out of pride, though pride was most of it. He had a genuine argument, and it had teeth. If they cowered in the fort, he raged, the British and the Iroquois would have the run of the entire valley. They would burn the farms, they would slaughter or steal the livestock. They would destroy the harvest these men had bled for, the harvest that was their family's survival through the coming winter. By the time Spaulding arrived, there might be nothing left to save but ashes. Why hide behind walls and watch your life's work burn? And this argument found a terrible resonance among the militia, because the militia were farmers. Their wealth, their food, their future stood out there in the fields, undefended. The thought of huddling in a fort while it all went up in smoke was unbearable to them. They grew restless. They grew angry. They began, in the dangerous way of frightened armed men, to grow insubordinate. Then Stewart did the thing that decided it. He called the senior officers cowards. He stood before the council and accused Colonel Zebulon Butler, a veteran, a man who had fought in real wars, of cowardice. He declared that if Butler would not give the order to march out and fight, then he, Lazarus Stewart, would lead the men out himself. He threatened, in effect, to seize command. And he did it leveraging a reputation for uncompromising, casual violence that everyone in that room understood was not a bluff. This is where the structure of the militia itself became fatal. These were New England men, and their militia operated on a democratic town meeting principle. Officers led by consent as much as by rank. There was no iron chain of command to slam down on a mutinous captain. When a charismatic, dangerous, popular firebrand stood up and called the cautious plan cowardice, and when the rank and file, anxious for their farms, hungry to fight, contemptuous of hiding, began to side with him, the senior officer's authority simply dissolved in their hands. And here, Zebulon Butler made the error that doomed them all. He was a good soldier. He knew with absolute certainty that marching out was suicide. But he was a man too, and he had just been called a coward in front of his community. And he could feel command slipping away from him toward a man who would lead these people to slaughter even more eagerly than caution would prevent it. Stung, cornered, afraid of losing control entirely, Zebulon Butler yielded. He surrendered his better judgment to the mob's fury. He gave the order to march. Stop and feel the weight of that moment, because everything turns on it. The single most important factor in the destruction of the Wyoming Valley was not British cunning. It was not Iroquois skill. It was not even the terrible terrain. It was pride, the pride of a frontier culture that had learned in 20 years of land wars that the bold man wins and the cautious man is a coward. That culture had served them once. Now it walked them into the swamp. They did not lose because they were outnumbered, though they were. They lost because they marched. They chose the field. They chose it to spite an insult, and the choice killed them. The men of Wyoming had survived 100 years of feud, 2 Pennamite wars, and every warning the frontier could give them. And in the end, what undid them was 2 syllables. The word coward, spoken by one of their own. The British did not have to break the gates of Fort. They only had to wait for the men inside to argue themselves into opening them. The timber gates of Fort were about to swing wide, and on the far side of those fields, lying flat in the long grass of a black swamp, 700 men waited in perfect silence for the bold men of the Wyoming Valley to come and find them. At approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the 3rd of July, 1778, the heavy timber gates of Fort swung open, and the men of the Wyoming Valley marched out to die. They did not know that, of course. They marched out the way frightened, angry, proud men march, with defiance, with noise, with a fife and a drum playing St. Patrick's Day in the morning, reportedly carrying the stars and stripes itself up the road. There is something almost unbearable about that detail. The music, the flag, the brave show of it, 375 farmers stepping out in the summer heat to the sound of a marching tune, walking north up what is now Wyoming Avenue, toward the Exeter Flats. To the men in the column, it must have felt like courage. From above, from the perspective of history, it looks like a funeral procession that did not yet know it was one. They had not gone far before the warning came. The last warning, the one that might still have saved them. At a bridge over Abraham's Creek, the column halted briefly, and an older settler named Thomas Bennett did something that took real nerve. He told the officers, to their faces, that they were marching straight into a snare, that the enemy was waiting, that if they kept going, they would be utterly destroyed. He was not a coward, and he was not a fool. He was a man who could read the country and the situation, and he begged them to understand what was about to happen. They ignored him. Of course they ignored him. Caution was the very thing they had just spent the morning calling cowardice. The momentum of the decision carried them past Bennett and his warning and on toward the flats. And all the while, unseen, Iroquois scouts shadowed the column through the trees, counting the Americans, marking their pace, reporting every yard of their advance back to Major John Butler. The Patriots thought they were marching to surprise a raiding party. In truth, the enemy knew their numbers, their formation, and their direction, before they had crossed half the distance. They were not the hunters. They had never been the hunters. They were being walked step by step into a box. Butler, for his part, was a craftsman, and now he performed the masterstroke of the whole campaign. A piece of battlefield deception so simple and so effective that it should be studied wherever such things are taught. He set Fort Wintermoot on fire. As the captured fort began to burn, thick columns of black smoke rolled up into the bright July sky, visible for miles, and the inexperienced American militia drew exactly the conclusion Butler intended them to draw. They saw the smoke and they thought, the British are burning what they cannot hold. The British are retreating. We have frightened them off. They are destroying the fort and pulling out. And so, instead of approaching with care, the Patriots quickened their pace. They grew eager. The careful advance loosened. Men hurried forward, hungry to catch a fleeing enemy, to turn this into the rout of cowardly Tories they had imagined. The smoke that should have warned them instead lured them. It was a lie written in fire, and they believed it completely. What they were actually hurrying toward was a killing ground that had been prepared with surgical care. Butler had chosen his position in what the accounts call a fine open wood. Terrain that looked inviting and was, in fact, a perfectly designed trap. He anchored his two wings on two very different kinds of cover, and the asymmetry of it was the genius of it. On the left, near the burning fort, Butler placed his own rangers and the Royal Greens, the Loyalists, the disciplined musket men. He set them in a line behind a long log fence, solid cover from which they could deliver concentrated, controlled volleys. This was the European-style anvil, the hard wall of fire. On the right, he placed the Seneca and the Cayuga under Sayenkaragta, nearly 500 warriors, and he extended them deep into a dense swamp. Tall grass, thick underbrush, soft, sucking ground. It was country that looked, to an approaching enemy, like an impassable edge of the battlefield, a flank not worth worrying about. It was, in reality, where the battle would be won, because hidden in that swamp grass was the hammer that would swing into the American flank and shatter it. And then Butler did the final, chilling thing, to keep his coalition coordinated, to keep them from firing too soon and revealing the trap. He prepared a signal, and he made himself visible to his own men in a way that tells you everything about how this kind of war was fought. He stripped off his British officer's uniform. He tied a black handkerchief around his head so his own warriors and rangers could recognize him in the chaos to come. And he gave the order that completed the snare. Lie down. The entire force, close to 700 men, Loyalist and Iroquois alike, lay flat against the earth, in the grass, behind the fence, in the swamp, and went absolutely, perfectly silent. Imagine the discipline that required. Hundreds of men, armed and ready, pressed to the ground in the summer heat, not moving, not speaking, while the enemy walked toward them through the smoke. Not a musket raised, not a sound. Just the long grass, the burning fort, and the patient, breathing silence of an army that had become invisible. The snare was set. All it needed now was for the bold men of the Wyoming Valley to walk into it. And they were coming on, fast, eager, certain they were chasing a beaten enemy. The Americans came within about 200 yards of the tree line and formed their single line of battle. Colonel Zebulon Butler took the right wing, the one closest to the river. Colonel Dennison and Lieutenant Colonel Dorrance took the left, the wing that abutted that dense, silent swamp. They dressed their line as best raw militia could, and they advanced. And as they advanced, they shouted. They flung taunts into the smoke and the trees, the bravado of men who believed they had the enemy on the run. "Come out, you villainous Tories," they called. "Come out and show your heads if you dare." There is a terrible innocence in those words, preserved in the survivors' accounts. They were daring an enemy to appear who had never gone anywhere, who lay, even then, 100 yards ahead of them, finger on the trigger, waiting. The Patriots halted and did what they had been trained, in their limited way, to do. They fired a volley into the tree line. A deafening crash of musketry, smoke blossoming along their line, lead tearing into the woods. Nothing answered. They loaded and fired a second volley. The thunder of it rolled across the flats. The woods swallowed the lead and gave back silence. A third volley, hundreds of muskets discharging into the grass and the trees and the burning haze. And still, nothing. No return fire, no cry, no movement. Just the eerie, unbroken stillness of a forest that seemed to be absorbing everything they could throw at it, without so much as flinching. Hold on that silence, because it is one of the most frightening things in the whole history of frontier warfare. The discipline it represents is almost superhuman. Hundreds of men lying flat, taking 3 volleys of musket fire over their heads and into their cover, and not a single one of them breaking, not one firing back early, not one rising in panic. Sayenqueracta's warriors and Butler's rangers simply absorbed it. They lay in the grass and let the Americans empty their first fury into the empty air, waiting with iron, inhuman patience for the range to close. The Patriots thought the silence meant the enemy had fled or was too frightened to answer. The silence meant the opposite. It meant the trap had not yet decided to spring. They let the Americans come to within 100 yards. And then Butler's rangers, behind their log fence, finally answered. The volley that came back was nothing like the wildfire the Americans had been throwing. It was concentrated, aimed, professional. The disciplined fire of veteran soldiers who had waited until they could not miss. It tore into the American line and stopped its advance dead, as though the column had walked into a wall. And at that exact instant, the right flank of the American line ceased to exist, because as the Rangers fired on the left, Sayenqueracta's Seneca rose out of the swamp. The survivors who lived to describe it reached every one of them for the same kind of language, that the warriors seemed to rise out of the very earth. Nearly 500 men who had been invisible one moment stood revealed the next, exploding upward out of the swamp grass directly against the American left flank. They fired a single devastating volley at point-blank range into the side of the militia line. And then they did the thing that broke the world for the men of the Wyoming Valley. They threw down their muskets, no time to reload, no need. And they charged, screaming their war cries, into the American flank with tomahawks and war clubs and spears. The American left, the wing under Denison and Dorrance, was instantly swallowed in a chaos of close, savage, hand-to-hand killing. There was no volley line anymore on that side, no formation, no order. Just farmers and boys suddenly fighting for their lives at arm's length against the most fearsome close combat warriors on the continent, in smoke so thick they could barely see, with the swamp at their backs. There was no time to reload, no time to think, no time to do anything but swing whatever you were holding and try not to die in the next half second. A musket is a clumsy club. A tomahawk in trained hands is not clumsy at all. The men of Wyoming had brought guns to a fight that, in its final yards, would be decided by blades. And they had been maneuvered with terrible precision into exactly the kind of close, formless slaughter where every advantage belonged to the other side. And it was in that exact moment, the flank caving, the line bending, the noise and smoke and terror at their absolute peak, that the entire battle turned on a single misheard word. Colonel Dennison saw his left flank being enveloped, saw the Seneca pouring around the end of his line, and he did the correct thing. The professional thing. He tried to save his men with a maneuver. He ordered the left flank to fall back, to pull back and pivot, to refuse the flank, to swing those endangered companies around so they faced the warriors who were curling around them rather than presenting their vulnerable side. Fall back was not a retreat. It was a controlled, deliberate adjustment. The kind of thing trained troops execute under fire to keep a threatened line intact. Done right, it might have held the flank together long enough to matter. It was a good order, given by a competent officer at the right moment. But these were not trained troops. These were farmers and boys in the deafening roar of their first real battle, half blind in black powder smoke, with men dying around them and warriors screaming toward them out of the grass. And in that hell of noise and terror, the command "fall back" traveled down the line and was heard by men with no experience to anchor it, men already at the very edge of panic, as something simpler and far more deadly. They heard "retreat," 2 syllables, swallowed by smoke and screaming, transformed in the passing from an order to maneuver into an order to run. And the line did not adjust. The line dissolved. That is the hinge of the entire catastrophe. Not the numbers, not the swamp, not even the pride that marched them out. The decisive instant, the 3 seconds on which 300 lives turned, was a single word, given correctly and heard wrongly, in the one place and the one moment where the difference between adjust and run was the difference between an organized fighting withdrawal and total annihilation. Dennison ordered a disciplined pivot. His men heard the end of the world, and so the end of the world is what they got. The disciplined withdrawal became, in an instant, a blind, screaming, every man for himself rout. The militia threw away their heavy muskets to run faster. The line did not bend. It shattered like glass all at once. The whole American formation coming apart along its length as men broke and fled toward the river or back toward the fort. And the moment they turned their backs and ran, they stopped being soldiers and became prey. A few tried to hold. Captain Dethick Hewitt, commanding the 40 Continental Regulars, the only real soldiers on the field, fought to keep the line together as everything came apart around him. When someone asked him whether they too should retreat, Hewitt's answer became one of the few proud lines to survive that day. "I'll be damned if I do," he reportedly shouted, and was shot down where he stood. He died refusing to run, which on that field meant simply that he died a little before the men who ran. And Lazarus Stewart, the firebrand, the Paxton boy, the man whose pride and fury had demanded this battle, who had called Zebulon Butler a coward to force the column out of the fort. Lazarus Stewart was killed in the onslaught, cut down alongside his own cousin. He got the fight he had insisted on. His body was left on the field he had been so desperate to reach. There is a brutal justice in that, and no comfort in it at all, because his pride did not only kill him, it killed almost everyone around him. The organized battle, the part with lines and volleys and maneuver, had lasted barely 30 to 45 minutes. The killing lasted for hours. This is the part the word battle does not capture, and it is why the survivors and the propagandists alike reached for the word massacre instead. Because once the American line broke, what followed was not combat. It was a hunt. Frontier warfare granted little quarter to armed men, and on this day it granted almost none. The Seneca warriors and Butler's rangers spread out across the flats and the woods and ran the fleeing militiamen down. Some of the warriors were settling old scores. Vengeance for Yankee raids in years past was a real and burning motive. Some were collecting the scalps for which the British paid bounties. All of them were faster, deadlier, and more at home in this country than the terrified farmers stumbling away from them. The men of Wyoming ran for the one thing that promised safety. The river, the Susquehanna, and the river became a graveyard. Dozens of patriots flung themselves into the water and tried to swim for the far bank, or to hide in the reeds and brush along the shore. Few made it. Warriors lined the bank and shot them in the water, or waded after them, or speared them as they swam. The current carried bodies downstream through the long summer evening. To this day, the place where so many died gave its name to a small island in the river. A marker of how many men chose the water over the tomahawk and found that the water offered no mercy either. The casualty figures, when they were finally tallied, were almost beyond belief. And here we must be honest about the sources, because the precise numbers are exactly the kind of thing that gets exaggerated and disputed. But the broad accounting is not seriously in question. Of the roughly 375 Americans who marched out of 40 Fort, more than 300 were killed. Major John Butler, in his own official dispatch, reported taking 227 scalps and only 5 prisoners. 227. He counted them. That number, written in a victor's report, is its own kind of monument, a measure of how complete, how methodical, how total the destruction was. And on the other side, Major Butler reported that he had lost 1 Indian killed, 2 Rangers killed, and 8 Indians wounded, 3 dead. Set that against more than 300. It is one of the most lopsided results of the entire Revolutionary War. A near-perfect annihilation purchased at almost no cost at all. Not a battle. Not even really a fight. A harvest, reaped in an afternoon, by men who had planted the trap with care and simply waited for the crop to walk into it. By the standards of pure tactics, Major John Butler had just achieved something close to perfection. He had used the valley's own pride against it, used the smoke and the swamp and the silence, and erased an entire community's defenders while losing 3 men. If the story ended here, it would be remembered, if it were remembered at all, as one of the most flawless small unit operations in American military history. But the story does not end here. It barely even begins here. Because a victory this total, won in a place like this, does not get to stay a victory. The wilderness had extended the British a tremendous line of credit that July afternoon. And the wilderness always collects. On the morning of the 4th of July, 1778, 2 years to the day after the Declaration of Independence, the survivors of the Wyoming Valley faced the wreckage of their world and did the only thing left to do. They surrendered. Colonel Nathan Dennison, now the senior officer remaining, formally gave up 40 Fort and the other blockades of the valley to Major John Butler. Zebulon Butler, the Patriot colonel, was already gone. He understood that as a Continental regular officer, he would be a prize prisoner, a high-value captive the British would never release. And so he had slipped away downriver toward Shamokin before the formal surrender. Leaving the valley, he could not save. It is easy to judge him for it. But he had argued against this disaster from the start, been overruled, watched it unfold exactly as he predicted, and had nothing left to offer but his own captivity. He chose to keep fighting another day. History would, in fact, give him more days. He survived the war. The terms of capitulation were the same generous terms Butler had offered all along. The survivors agreed to lay down their arms, to demolish their fortifications, and to remain neutral for the rest of the war. In return, Butler promised that the lives of the non-combatants would be spared and their persons protected. And here we have to be scrupulously fair to the historical record, because this is precisely where the legend and the facts diverge most violently. Major John Butler, by the evidence, largely kept that promise regarding human lives. There is no credible historical evidence that women, children, or non-combatants were murdered by the British or the Iroquois after the forts surrendered. This is not a defense of the man. He had just presided over the slaughter of 300 people. But the truth matters, especially here, because the lie that replaced it would itself become a weapon. Butler himself wrote in his official dispatch, with a coldness that chills more than any invented atrocity, that not a single person was hurt except such as were in arms. To these, in truth, the Indians gave no quarter. The armed men were hunted to near extinction. The unarmed were, by and large, spared. That was the grim, specific shape of what actually happened. What Butler could not do, what he completely failed to do, was control his allies when it came to property. And the destruction of property in that valley was total. Over the days that followed, the Seneca and the Cayuga systematically dismantled the Wyoming Valley as a place where people could live. They looted and burned. By the time they were done, more than 1,000 houses, barns, and mills had been put to the torch. 1,000 head of cattle, sheep, and hogs were driven off. The breadbasket of the Susquehanna, the granary that had fed Washington's starving army, the whole strategic reason this campaign existed, was simply erased. The fields would stand, but there was no one left to work them and nothing left to work them with. The British had achieved their objective completely. The valley would feed no one now. And so, by every conventional measure, the campaign was a flawless success. The defenders annihilated, the food source destroyed, the fortifications demolished, the survivors neutralized, and all of it accomplished for the loss of 3 men. Major John Butler had done everything his command in Niagara could possibly have asked of him, and more. He had also, without knowing it, just handed the American cause the most powerful propaganda weapon of the entire war. The smoke had not even cleared, and the wilderness was already preparing its invoice. As night fell on the 3rd of July, the horror of the battlefield gave way to something older and, to European eyes, more terrible still. And it is here that history blurs almost entirely into legend. Here, around a stone by the river, that the Wyoming Massacre, as Americans would remember it for 2 centuries, was born. To understand what allegedly happened that night, you have to understand the Haudenosaunee tradition of the Morning War. In Iroquoian culture, warfare was bound up with grief and spiritual restoration. The ritual torture and execution of captives was, however shocking to outsiders, a recognized practice, a way of avenging fallen warriors, of channeling a community's mourning, of restoring a kind of cosmic balance after loss. It was not random cruelty. It was ceremony, with its own logic and its own deep history. This does not make it less terrible to modern sensibilities, but it places it in its true context, which the propaganda would deliberately strip away. According to the most sensationalized survivor accounts, above all that of a man named Lebbeus Hammond, who escaped to tell it. Small groups of captured patriots were taken that night to be executed in this fashion. And the most infamous of these alleged scenes unfolded around a large stone near the river, a stone that would pass into American folklore under 2 names, the Bloody Rock and Queen Esther's Rock. The story, as it was told and retold and embellished across generations, went like this. As many as 16 American prisoners were arranged in a circle around the rock, and a woman moved among them, a woman the accounts called Queen Esther. Her name was Esther Montour, a matriarch of mixed French and Indigenous descent who led a Muncie, Delaware village at Sheshequin. According to the legend, she went around the circle one by one, methodically crushing the skulls of the bound prisoners with a maul or a tomahawk, chanting a death song as she killed. And the legend supplied her motive: vengeance, raw and personal, for a son of hers who had allegedly been killed by patriots earlier in the campaign. A grieving mother turned executioner, moving around the rock in the firelight, singing as she swung. It is a genuinely horrifying image. It is also, almost certainly, mostly false. And the way modern historians have taken it apart is itself instructive. Look closely, and the story falls to pieces in your hands. The contemporary descriptions of Queen Esther do not even agree on what she looked like. Some accounts call her a heavy-set woman, others a tall and elegant figure in fine clothes. Wildly different people, wearing the same name. Worse, the geography does not work. Serious analysis of where her village stood and where the battle was fought suggests it would have been highly improbable, if not impossible, for her to have traveled to that rock in time to do what the legend claims. A growing number of historians conclude she was very likely not present at the battle at all. The bloody rock may have witnessed executions that night. Captive killing did occur, but the demonic queen at its center looks less like a person than like a figure assembled out of fear. And yet, here is the crucial point. The factual truth of Queen Esther turned out to matter far less than the mythological power of her, because the image of her was exactly what a young nation, hungry to justify itself, needed. The Butcher of Wyoming, the blood-soaked native queen swinging her maul in the dark, became one of the most potent pieces of what scholars call savagism, a deliberate narrative framework used to paint Indigenous people as something less than human. And that framework did precise political work. It shifted the blame for the disaster away from the Patriots' own catastrophic decision to march out of a defensible fort. It transformed a defeat caused by frontier pride into an atrocity caused by inhuman savagery. And it built, brick by brick, the moral case for everything that would be done to Native peoples in the decades to come. The dispossession, the removal, the killing. The lie about a woman at a rock helped license the destruction of nations. The accuracy of the story was beside the point. The story was the weapon, and it was about to be loaded into the most effective propaganda campaign of the entire revolution. Here is the great paradox at the heart of the Wyoming Valley, the thing that makes it one of the most strategically important battles you have never heard of. On the battlefield, Major John Butler won a flawless, almost perfect victory. In the war for the minds of the American people, he suffered one of the most catastrophic defeats of the entire conflict. And the second thing mattered infinitely more than the first. As the traumatized survivors and refugees stumbled eastward into the settled parts of Pennsylvania and New York, they carried their stories with them, and the stories grew in the telling, as stories of horror always do. Within weeks, those stories reached the printing presses, and the American press of 1778 did to the Wyoming Valley what propaganda has always done to atrocity. It took a real and terrible event and inflated it into a national nightmare bearing almost no resemblance to the facts. The most influential of these accounts came from the press of a Patriot publisher named John Holt, and they achieved enormous circulation. And the fabricated version of Wyoming that spread across the colonies was a masterpiece of atrocity propaganda. Compare the myth to the fact, point by point, and you can watch the lie being manufactured. The myth said that hundreds of women and children had been locked inside Fort and burned alive, when in fact the non-combatants had been spared, and Butler had specifically protected them. The myth said that Loyalists had hunted down and butchered their own Patriot brothers in cold blood, a tale of fratricidal evil, when the reality, brutal as it was the granting of no quarter to armed men in a frontier battle. And the myth said that Joseph Brant, the famous Mohawk, had commanded the savage horde and personally directed the slaughter of innocents, when Brant, as we have seen, was not within 100 miles of the place. Every one of these claims has been thoroughly discredited by modern historians. Every one of them was false, and every one of them worked. Because here is what the lie accomplished. Before the summer of 1778, the frontier war had seemed, to the comfortable elites of the coastal cities, like a distant and peripheral thing, somebody else's brutal little conflict out in the backcountry, of no great concern to the real war along the seaboard. The fabricated Wyoming Massacre changed that overnight. It unified the American public in a single surge of outrage. It put a face on British villainy, the face of an empire so depraved it would unleash savages upon helpless women and children. It erased whatever lingering sympathy remained for the Loyalist cause and the possibility of reconciliation. The story of Wyoming did more to harden American resolve and demonize the crown than any battlefield victory could have. And it did not stop at the water's edge. The outrage crossed the Atlantic. The reports of Wyoming damaged Britain's moral standing in the courts and salons of Europe at the worst possible moment, precisely as France was entering the war on the American side. Precisely when the perception of British conduct mattered enormously to the diplomacy of the whole conflict. A massacre that largely had not happened in a valley most Europeans could not have found on a map helped tilt the moral weight of a world war. This is the first great irony of the Wyoming Valley, and it is enormous. Major Butler's perfect tactical victory produced a strategic catastrophe for his own side. The more completely he won, the worse it was for Britain. He destroyed the valley so thoroughly that the destruction itself became a story too good for the Patriots to leave alone. And the story they built from it became a recruiting sergeant, a diplomatic weapon, and a permanent stain on the British cause. He had won the field and lost the narrative. And in this war, the narrative was the field that mattered. The wilderness had handed him his victory, and then it had quietly begun to charge him for it. But the bill the wilderness presented was not only made of newsprint and outrage. It was also made of cold and hunger and the long dying of the innocent. Because while the propagandists in their print shops were transforming Wyoming into a national legend, the actual survivors of the valley were walking into a wilderness that would kill them as indifferently as any tomahawk. With their homes reduced to ash, their livestock driven off, their food destroyed, the surviving civilians of the Wyoming Valley. And remember who these were now, after 300 of the men had died. These were the widows, the orphans, the elderly, the broken remnant of a community had nowhere to stay and nothing to stay for. So they fled, east, toward the Delaware River and the safety of Fort Penn, near present-day Stroudsburg. Some 60 miles of mountains lay between them and refuge, and the route ran straight through a place that would earn, that summer, one of the bleakest names on the American map. It was a vast, dense, murky marshland in the Pocono Mountains. A tangle of swamp and bog and trackless wet forest that the desperate refugees had to cross with no road to guide them. They were fleeing without adequate clothing, without shelter, without provisions. Women who had lost husbands and sons 3 days before, dragging children through a swamp, with no food and no help and no end in sight. And the swamp did what swamps do to the unprepared and the exhausted. It killed them. Starvation took them, Exhaustion took them. Exposure took them, even in summer, as the wet and the cold and the sheer impossibility of the crossing wore them down one by one. The death toll was so high, the suffering so total, that the survivors gave the place a name it has carried ever since. They called it the Shades of Death, not a poetic flourish, a description. People walked into that marsh and did not walk out, and those who did emerged having watched the others fall. And even the wilderness was not the worst of it, because the war had not stopped. The horror multiplied in scattered individual tragedies that the grand histories barely have room for. There was the Learn family, who kept a tavern near the edge of the swamp. They were attacked by roving bands of warriors, and John Learn and his son George were killed, while George's wife and infant daughter were carried off and later murdered. And the raids did not end when the battle did. They went on for months. That November, 4 months after Wyoming, 3 Delaware warriors fell upon the farm of a Quaker family near Wilkes Barre who had actually survived the battle, trusting that their pacifism and their good relations with the local nations would shield them. The warriors carried off a 5-year-old girl named Frances Slocum. She would vanish into the Indigenous interior for nearly 60 years. Raised first among the Delaware, then the Miami, marrying a chief, becoming a different person entirely. And her family would not find her again until 1837, when an aged woman in distant Indiana was finally recognized as the long-lost child. Her father and grandfather would be killed in yet another raid only weeks after she was taken. Every one of these is a story, a whole life, swallowed by a violence that simply did not stop when the battle technically ended. This is the second great irony, and it is the one that gives the whole episode its haunted quality. The military defeat at Wyoming was already a catastrophe, but the wilderness took that catastrophe and extended it, deepened it, dragged it out across 60 miles of swamp and weeks of dying, until the line between battle and aftermath disappeared entirely. The frontier did not finish its killing on the 3rd of July. It just changed its methods. The tomahawk gave way to the cold and the hunger, and the dying went on. The Shades of Death is where you begin to understand the real meaning of this story. Why we keep returning to that image of the ledger, the debt, the wilderness that collects. The Wyoming Valley had been a place of human quarrels, charters and land claims and pride and the old hatreds of the Pennamite Wars. But the wilderness did not care about any of that. It received the dead of both the battle and its aftermath with the same vast indifference. And it was not finished. It had collected from the people of the valley. Now, with the same patience, it would turn and begin to collect from the men who had won. The propaganda did one more thing, and it was the most consequential of all. It forced George Washington to act. For a long time, the commander-in-chief had treated the frontier as a sideshow, a drain on resources he could not spare from the real war against the British Army. But the destruction of the Wyoming Valley's grain supply was a genuine logistical wound, and the tidal wave of public outrage that followed made the frontier impossible to ignore any longer. The breadbasket was gone. The people demanded vengeance. And so, in 1779, Washington authorized something far larger and far more terrible than a frontier raid. He authorized a campaign of total war against the Iroquois Confederacy itself. It was called the Sullivan-Clinton Expedition, after its commanders, Major General John Sullivan and Brigadier General James Clinton. And the scale of it announced its purpose. Nearly 4,500 Continental regulars, not militia, not local levies, but a major field army, drawn from the strength Washington could so ill afford to divert, was assembled and pointed at the heartland of the Six Nations. The Wyoming strategy had aimed to force Washington to peel away Continental troops to defend the frontier. It had succeeded beyond any British hope, but not in the way Niagara intended. Washington did not send those troops to defend. He sent them to destroy. Washington's written orders were among the coldest he ever gave. He called for nothing less than the total destruction and devastation of the Iroquois settlements. He instructed Sullivan not to listen to any overtures of peace, not to accept any treaty, until the Iroquois homeland had been utterly ruined. This was not a campaign to defeat an army. It was a campaign to erase a civilization's ability to feed itself. In the late summer of 1779, Sullivan's army marched into the Finger Lakes country of western New York and carried out exactly what it had been ordered to carry out. The Iroquois and their Loyalist allies, badly outnumbered, could offer almost no resistance. Only a brief stand at the Battle of Newtown, quickly brushed aside. And then Sullivan's men went to work on the things that could not run away. They burned 40 Iroquois towns to the ground. They cut down the orchards, ancient apple and peach trees, the patient work of generations, girdled and felled. And they destroyed the food. An estimated 160,000 bushels of corn, beans, and squash, the famous three sisters of Haudenosaunee agriculture, put to the torch or trampled into the dirt. Many modern scholars do not flinch from the word for this. They call it ethnic cleansing. A number call it genocide outright, though the term remains debated among historians. The objective was never simply to beat the Iroquois in battle. It was to annihilate their capacity to exist as independent nations, to break them so completely that they could never again threaten the frontier. And in that aim, it largely succeeded. The Sullivan expedition shattered the agricultural foundation of the Iroquois Confederacy. It drove its people from a homeland they had held for centuries. And it did something else, something that brings this entire story full and terrible circle. It shifted the burden of keeping the Iroquois alive squarely onto the British Empire. Because when you destroy a people's food and burn their homes in late summer, you do not kill them outright. You send them, starving, toward whoever promised to protect them. And the Iroquois had been promised protection by the Crown. So the survivors of Sullivan's campaign turned, by the thousands, and fled toward the one place that was supposed to be their refuge. They fled toward the British fort at Niagara. And it is there, in the snow, that the wilderness finally presented the full and final bill for the perfect victory at Wyoming. More than 5,000 Iroquois refugees, overwhelmingly women, children, and the elderly, the Seneca and Cayuga and Onondaga, whose warriors had stood in that swamp the year before, streamed westward toward Fort Niagara in the autumn of 1779. They arrived with nothing. The clothes they wore and little else. Their towns were ash, their fields were ash, their orchards were stumps. They came to the British, their allies, as the only hope of survival they had left. And what happened next dwarfed, in sheer human cost, everything that had happened on every battlefield of the frontier war combined. The British command at Niagara, under Lieutenant Colonel Mason Bolton, was utterly unprepared. They had no plan for 5,000 starving refugees. They had not stockpiled food for such a multitude. The king's stores were meant to feed a garrison, not a displaced nation. And the timing could not have been worse, because the winter that was coming would be one of the most savage in living memory. The winter of 1779 into 1780 was apocalyptic. Snow drifted to a depth of 8 feet on the parade ground of the fort itself. 8 feet, a wall of white that paralyzed the whole landscape. The cold killed the deer and the game the people had always relied on, so that even the wilderness that might have fed them in better times was frozen shut. And the supply lines that might have rescued them were severed by ice. Across the whole of the Great Lakes, only a single supply ship had managed to reach the post before winter slammed the door. One ship against 5,000 mouths, and the worst winter in memory. What followed was not a battle. It was a slow, grinding humanitarian catastrophe, and the details of it are almost unbearable. The refugees had no proper shelter. They built crude lean-tos against the cold. They piled up stones for windbreaks. They dug caves into the frozen earth and crawled inside to escape the wind, and many of them froze to death in those earthen dugouts, buried alive by the cold before they were buried by the spring. When the king's stores gave out, as they swiftly did, people ate whatever might keep them alive one more day. They ate maggot-infested hides. They ate the entrails of animals. They boiled and chewed elm bark. They gathered acorns. They ate the kinds of things that human beings eat only when the alternative is dying that night. And many of them ate them and died anyway. And disease moved through the camps the way disease always moves through the starving and the freezing. The fort's hospital was overwhelmed. Scurvy from the lack of fresh food, dysentery, dropsy from spoiled meat, tetanus, chilblains, malnutrition in every form. People died in numbers no one even properly counted. The bodies of those who froze in their dugouts often lay where they fell, covered by the snow, until the spring thaw made it possible for work details to dig them out and bury them. In quicklime, in mass graves, because there were too many to bury any other way. And there is a final cruelty woven into it, one that closes the circle completely. Many of the warriors freezing and starving in that camp were the very men who had risen out of the swamp grass at Wyoming. The Seneca and Cayuga, who had won the most one-sided victory of the entire war, who had lost 3 of their number while killing 300. Now they watched their own mothers and children and elders die slowly in the snow. The hands that had sprung the perfect trap could do nothing at all against the cold. Hundreds died. By some estimates, as much as a fifth of the more than 5,000 who had reached Niagara perished before spring. And here is the proportion that should reframe this entire story in your mind. More people may have died slowly in the snow and the frozen dugouts outside that British fort of cold and hunger and disease than fell in any single battle of the entire frontier war. The bloodless arithmetic of Wyoming, 300 dead against 3, was, in the end, repaid many times over, in a currency the victors never imagined they would have to pay. And it broke the British war machine in the region. The empire that had orchestrated the brilliant ambush at Wyoming, that had won the wilderness so cheaply, now found itself financially and logistically crippled by the simple, crushing necessity of trying to keep thousands of its starving allies alive through the cold. The cost of that obligation, the food, the supplies, the sheer impossible weight of it, effectively neutralized British offensive power in the region for the rest of the war. They could not feed their friends and fight their enemies at the same time. The wilderness had presented its final invoice, and the price of the perfect victory at Wyoming turned out to be the strategic paralysis of the empire that won it. This is why the British came to dread the wilderness. Read the dread correctly, because it is the whole point. They did not fear the frontier because they could not win battles in it. They had just proven, at Wyoming, that they could win the most lopsided battle imaginable. They feared it because they had learned the terrible lesson the land was teaching. In the wilderness, victory and ruin were not opposites. They were the same thing, separated only by time. You could win everything in an afternoon and spend the next 2 years watching that victory consume your allies, your supplies, your strategy, and your moral standing in the eyes of the world. The forest did not punish you for losing. It punished you for winning if you won the wrong way, in the wrong place. And there was no way to win in the wilderness that the wilderness would not eventually make you pay for. The men at the center of this story scattered into the fates that history allows. Major John Butler, the architect of the perfect ambush, survived the war. His Rangers fought on, feared to the end. But he could never escape the legend he had helped create. The Wyoming Massacre clung to his name like smoke, the propaganda outliving the man, so that he is remembered far more for an atrocity he largely did not commit than for the genuine tactical brilliance he undeniably did. The lie was his most lasting creation, and it was not even his. Sayenquiragta, the old king of the Senecas, the true tactical mind behind the swamp that swallowed the American left. He led his people through the catastrophe that followed, through Sullivan's burning and the Niagara winter, fighting for a homeland that the war was destroying around him no matter who won the battles. Cornplanter would live long into the new American Republic, navigating the wreckage of his nation's defeat, a leader of a people the war had broken. Zebulon Butler, the Patriot colonel who had begged them not to march, who was overruled and slipped away downriver, lived too, and went on serving the cause he had nearly died for. He had been right about everything, and being right had saved no one. And Lazarus Stewart, the firebrand, the Paxton boy, the man whose pride opened the gate of the trap from the inside, Lazarus Stewart got precisely the battle he demanded, and died in the first minutes of it. His body left on the ground he had been so desperate to reach. He is the dark center of the whole human tragedy, not killed by the enemy's cunning so much as by his own. The man who called caution cowardice and led his neighbors into the swamp to prove it. Queen Esther, Esther Montour, may not even have been there. But the legend of her, the demon at the Bloody Rock, outlived every real person in this story and did more damage than any of them. She became the face of a lie that helped justify the destruction of nations, and the lie is still being untangled by historians today. And the bathhouse attendant of this story, the small, forgotten figures, they vanished as they always do. The widows who survived the shades of death. The children like Francis Slocum, carried off into a different life entirely. The thousands of unnamed Iroquois who froze in earthen caves at Niagara and were buried in quicklime when the snow finally let go of them in spring. War remembers its commanders and its legends. It forgets the people who actually paid for them. The forest kept them all the same, with perfect indifference, asking no one's name. The ruins are quiet now. The Wyoming Valley is a settled, ordinary place. You can drive up Wyoming Avenue, the road the militia marched out along, in a few minutes. There is a monument near the battlefield, raised generations later, with the names of the dead carved into stone. The Bloody Rock has its marker. The Shades of Death is just woods and marsh again, a name on old maps. Fort Niagara still stands above the river, and no plaque there counts the refugees who starved in the snow around it. The places have forgotten what they witnessed. The land does that. It receives the dead and grows quiet and gives nothing back. So what does the Wyoming Valley finally teach? Beyond the tragedy, beyond the legend, beyond the long catalog of the dead. It teaches the most uncomfortable lesson in all of military history, that a flawless tactical victory can be a strategic disaster. Major John Butler did everything right on the 3rd of July, 1778. His deception was perfect. His coordination was perfect. His patience was superhuman. He destroyed an entire enemy force at the cost of 3 men. And that perfect victory set in motion a chain of consequences. The propaganda, the hardened resolve, the diplomatic damage, the Sullivan Campaign, the Niagara Winter, that ruined his own side more thoroughly than any defeat could have. Winning the battle was the worst thing the British could have done. They simply had no way of knowing that at the time, which is exactly what makes it tragic. It teaches that pride is more dangerous than the enemy. The men of Wyoming were not destroyed by Butler's 1,000. They were destroyed by their own decision to march out and meet them. A decision driven not by tactics, but by the inability to bear an accusation of cowardice. The strongest wall in the valley was the timber of 40 Fort, and they walked out from behind it to defend their pride. The trap was real, but the door was opened from the inside. It teaches how small the hinge of catastrophe can be. 300 lives turned on a single misheard word, fall back, heard as retreat. In the smoke and terror of a flank collapse, an order to maneuver, heard as an order to run. The difference between a fighting withdrawal and a massacre was 2 syllables, swallowed by panic. History is full of these hinges, these tiny moments where everything pivots. And they are almost never the grand decisions we expect. Sometimes the empire turns on a word, and it teaches the thing that gave this video its name, that the wilderness keeps a ledger. The frontier was not a stage on which men acted out their wars. It was a participant, patient, and indifferent, that extended victory like a line of credit and then collected, with interest, in a currency of its own choosing. It collected from the men of Wyoming in the swamp and the river. It collected from the refugees in the shades of death. And it collected from the victors at Fort Niagara in the snow, where the perfect victory of the wilderness finally came due. The British learned to dread the wilderness not because it could defeat them, but because it would not let them win cleanly. There was always a price. There was always an invoice. And the forest always collected. 375 men marched out of 40 Fort to a fife and a drum, into a snare set in a fine open wood by a swamp. Within an hour, their valley's defense was gone. Within a week, their homes were ash, and their families were dying in a mountain marsh. Within a year, an American army was burning the homeland of the men who had beaten them. Within 2 years, those same victorious men were freezing to death in the snow outside a British fort, eating bark to stay alive. Each of those catastrophes seemed, at the time, like a separate event, a battle, a flight, a campaign, a winter. They were not separate. They were a single chain, each link forged by the one before it, all of them hanging from the same nail. The line that connects all of it runs straight, and it runs through one summer afternoon in 1778, when a few hundred proud men chose the field over the wall. The frontier gave the British Empire its cleanest victory of the entire Revolution. And then, slowly, patiently, over 2 terrible years, it made them understand what that victory had cost. They had won the Wyoming Valley. They could not survive winning it. That is the curse of the frontier. Not that you cannot win there, that you can. And that winning is sometimes the most expensive thing a man, or an army, or an empire can possibly do. The wilderness does not take sides. It only keeps the ledger. And in the end, it collects from everyone. It's from